where they had once been independent and where they were consulted by rulers, they became impoverished. Their educational systems became backwater kind of systems, and the level of education that was offered in those institutions was at a relatively low level. Their ability to deal with the world at large was relatively limited compared to their impact upon their societies before colonialism. So among Muslim intellectuals, you had a couple of trains or streams of response to the situation in which they found themselves. One was a secularist response, which was to say, you know what, the reason that we got conquered is because of Islam. You know, those people who conquered us, we need to learn everything from them. So those were secularists. You know, they wanted no part of Islam, and they were hostile to Islam. And then you had modernists who wanted to identify themselves with Islam, and they were trying to give dawah according to their understanding or to the best of their ability to Islam, but they were confronted with this situation that something has gone wrong here. And so there was this re-examination of how are we interpreting Islam. And they were quite impressed with Western culture and civilization and its accomplishments. And they began trying to say, you know what, this thing that you have, it's really was already there in Islam. And this thing that you have, well, it's already there in Islam. And so whatever it was, there was a feature of Western civilization, then Islam was interpreted in a way that would say, yeah, you know, Islam agrees with that. And part of that was warranted and part of it was unwarranted. It was a very apologetic approach to understanding Islam. And to a certain extent, there were cultural accretions and scholarly opinions that had accumulated over the centuries, which were not necessarily based in the Quran and the Sunnah. And so, to a certain extent, those people did a service of pointing out those kind of things, but they went overboard in accepting the European way of looking at things as the standard by which Islam should be judged. Now, you also had a body of scholars who just withdrew into themselves and wanted nothing to do with that outside world. They studied those classical books that they had been taught by their teachers and their teachers before them, and their response to modernity, which was to try to build a wall that would separate them from that world, that larger world. And within that space that they defined, then they could live Islamically, and outside that space, you didn't want to go there because that would mean compromising your Islam. So on some level, they were able to preserve their Islamic way of life, but it came at the expense of being an effective part of the society in which they lived. Then there was, after that first major generation of modernists, of course, subcontinent, you know about Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, Muhammad Abdu, Jamaluddin al-Afghani. They were major proponents of that same point of view in the center of the Islamic lands and in Egypt. What happened in the generation that followed was a reaction to modernism, where Islamists like Hassan al-Banna and Maulana Maududi, they said, wait a minute, why are we trying to explain Islam in a way that will be comfortable to Westerners? You know, there's this wrong with their point of view, there's this. They began to say, you know, there's all kinds of things wrong with Western civilization. But they had absorbed some of the aspects of modernity, and so they were not traditionalists in the sense of those people who just wanted to close themselves off from that outside world. They said, you know, we need to change this situation at large. So They got themselves into the political arena, but particularly Jamaat Islami in the Indian subcontinent in the 50s, 60s, they began doing a lot of thinking about and research into the idea of, well, what would it mean to have an Islamic economy? We've been under the thumb of European economic system for a long time, so long that the features of our system have kind of disappeared. So these economists from the Jamaat Islami background, and there were also people thinking about this area also in the Arab world, they were looking at what it would mean to run an economy Islamically. Now, because of the political activities of the Islamists, the secular governments in those countries tended to look at them with suspicion. They considered them a threat to the survival of their secular governments. And so things that were associated with Islamic economics, because they were presented by these people, it was something that they were not interested in even listening to. One of the part of the world that was doing something in this area without anybody really knowing about it, they were just quietly going about it. Malaysia, when it became independent, one of the things they did was set up a bank called Tabung Haji, which was specifically designed to accept deposits from people who wanted to save money to go to Hajj. And so this money that was being saved up was, substantial amounts, and they wanted to invest that in ways that would be halal. And so they began investing in agricultural products, construction projects, and stuff like that. And in Egypt, during the Nasser era, there was an apolitical visionary who set up some savings houses, what they're called, in the Nile Delta region of northern Egypt. And they were based on giving non-interest loans to farmers and small entrepreneurs. And they attracted deposits from the people in that area. Because Nasser had spent a lot of energy fighting the Ikhwan al-Muslimun, even though this man was not associated with the Ikhwan, he shut down these banks. So nobody was really talking about Islamic banking in the 60s. In the early 70s, the Islamic Development Bank was set up, which was around the same time as the 1973 oil embargo. Suddenly, there were a lot of Muslim countries that had a lot of liquidity. They had cash, and they contributed to the development of this bank for all the Muslims. And part of the feature of the bank that they were talking about was that we should try to run a bank that's a non-interest bearing bank. And how do you do that? Nobody really knew. There were some kind of ideas, but nothing was solidly in place. They're going to take a break and come back, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. I'm Husseini, wishing all viewers of Peace TV Ramadan Kareem. May Allah accept our Saum and our Qiyam. Ameen.
Say indeed, my prayer, my sacrifice, my life and my death are all for Allah, sustainer of the world.
A dynamic.
I challenge any human being to point out a single fundamental of Islam
In youthful quest.
Which is against humanity as a whole.
Iconic, inspiring, encouraging.
Don't judge Islam based on the following.
Farik Naik.
Judge Islam based on the authentic sources. That's the glorious Quran and the authentic Hadith.
Son of the world-famous orator on Islam and comparative religion, Dr. Zakir Naik.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us an opportunity to do a proper job and to earn a proper reward.
A star above par in Teens Star. Every Friday at 4:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 10:30 a.m. Saudi Arabia on Peace TV.
If you look at the history of the masjid by the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam,
Dr. Ahmad Ibn Saifuddin.
You'll find that the masjid was a place for almost every activity.
A place of learning, a place of social gathering, a place of unity.
The masjid was all of that.
The Progressive Community Center in Islam.
It is the place that you get the charge of Iman in, because nothing is like a masjid.
Understand the proper significance of mosques in dealing with religious and social activities of Muslims in the Masjid, Roles and Rules. Tomorrow at 7 p.m. and repeat telecast at 7 a.m. Saudi Arabia on Peace TV.
If I were to ask you about the life of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, about the incidents that occurred before his prophethood and in Mecca and in Medina, about the names of his loved ones and his wives and his children, how much would we be able to know? How many incidents have we memorized? Brothers and sisters, isn't it more important that we study the seerah of the most important human being who ever walked the face of this earth? Join me, your host Yasir Qadhi, as we discuss the most important biography of the most illustrious human being that ever lived, the seerah of our beloved Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Join Yasir Qadhi in Seerah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 4 a.m. Saudi Arabia on Peace TV. Spreading awareness.
If you go way back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, we find that the companions, they differed, but the difference was not in clashing and fighting.
Why this issue is so controversial today in Islam.
Promoting righteousness.
All the four scholars themselves, they said, if you find a hadith that goes against my saying, then you take the hadith.
Once the concept is understood, I think many problems will be solved.
Emphasizing God's message of peace for humankind.
Never take as a close, intimate friend except a mu'min.
One who has the taqwa, or the truthful,
Uplifting our faith and good deeds.
Patience in the obedience of Allah. Patience in abstaining from that which is haram. The greater the reward is in this life and the hereafter.
Grasp the opportunity to enhance your knowledge of Islam in Islamic Viewpoint. Next on Peace TV.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, welcome back. So in the early 70s, you see the Islamic Development Bank, all the nations of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation were part of it, and there were some wealthy members who provided funds, and it was set up on the idea that they would provide non-interest-based loans to the needy member states. On a private level, also in the mid-70s or so, we saw the establishment of Dubai Islamic Bank in the United Arab Emirates. It was set up by a visionary businessman who had good relations with the ruling family, and they weren't afraid of him, and therefore he had leeway to start developing an institution that was predicated on not having interest. When Mohammed bin Faisal, the son of the king of Saudi Arabia, he set up a bank in Egypt, which was the Faisal Islamic Bank, I think it's called. One of the things that made that unique was that he said, you know what, for this whole thing to be halal, we need input from scholars. We need to have some scholars who are on a board that they're permanent advisors to us. Before that, on an ad hoc basis, people were running these early banks would ask questions to Sharia scholars. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? But it wasn't a formal arrangement. With the Faisal Islamic Bank in Egypt, it was a part of the structure of the bank to have these Sharia advisors. And as other Islamic banks began to be established, what that did was it started to invigorate Islamic scholarship in the area of muamalat, transactions. There were new issues that scholars had to think about and do research on, and go back to the books and see, well, what's the precedent for this? So it provided a real spurt of impetus for renewed scholarship in fiqh. There's a tremendous side effect of Islamic banking. And another thing that it did was that it created an alliance between wealthy Muslim businessmen, on the one hand, who became involved in setting up these banks, and these scholars who had been studying these ancient books in their madrasas, and they were from poor backgrounds and living impoverished lives, and they were now being consulted by these very wealthy people and being hired for that purpose. And people with that kind of expertise, things started to look up for them on a worldly level. And it became a very specialized kind of branch of learning. It would help a lot if you were an expert in muamalat, but it would also help a lot if you knew something about economics and finance. And most people who studied fiqh in a madrasa, they had no knowledge at all about the way the modern economic system worked. And so initially there was like this bringing together of Islamic scholars and people with training in modern economics and finance in order for the scholars to be able to understand what is it that we're being asked to deliver a ruling on. Al-hukmu ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi. Passing judgment on something requires that you understand it. So these people from the banks would be advising the scholars on what was going on, and the scholars were also studying and upgrading themselves. The people that began to show prominence in this field, as more and more Islamic banks began opening up, everybody was knocking on the same door. Sheikh so-and-so, that bank that was started 2 or 3 years ago, they wanted you to be on their Sharia board. You've demonstrated your ability. Please be on our Sharia board also. And in the Middle East, Islamic banks were developing ad hoc. It was individual initiatives. Governments weren't particularly interested in it. The other model, though, was that followed by Malaysia. In the 1980s, under Prime Minister Mahathir, his government systematically started, and they set up the first Islamic bank in the early 80s. And they were really looking at it from a holistic, systemic point of view. So they saw that, okay, to really run this system, you're going to need to educate people. You're going to have human capital to run these things properly. And so they began studying Islamic finance, offering it as subjects in the university systems. And now they've set up entire dedicated grad schools to that. And every university in Malaysia has an Islamic finance department for the study of this area. So you can't possibly begin to run this system without human capital. And setting up research institutes in order to study the problems systematically of how to do a Sharia-compliant financial system. So Malaysia has pioneered the way in that. And they've also pioneered trying to set up Islamic capital markets, not just banks, Islamic capital markets, an Islamic insurance sector, the takaful sector, and then a regulatory framework that makes sure that these institutions are running properly. In the Middle East, you really don't have that kind of a governmental approach to setting up this sector as a cohesive sector. Bahrain is a possible exception, and there are manifestations of some kind of oversight in the Middle East. I mean, Islamic banks still they're still regulated by the central banks, but the kind of vision and care that Malaysia for example, set up in trying to move this enterprise into being a real functioning Sharia-compliant system. Malaysia has done that more systematically than any other country. Indonesia, since the overthrow of the dictator, it's now also been following the Malaysian example and model to a large extent, though there's some differences. Pakistan is an example of a country where there was a change by decree that, okay, tomorrow we're going to have an Islamic banking system. Riba will be no longer allowed in the country. You can't set up a system like that simply by decree. Tomorrow came and nothing really changed very much. I mean, Pakistan, they did that initial attempt to institute that kind of a system, and it failed. And then some years later, they re-examined it and tried to learn from their mistakes, and they've done a phase 2 to try to put that in place. There are certain countries, like Malaysia, which has a dual system. They say, we're not going to outlaw conventional banks. We're going to have this conventional system running side by side with this non-interest system, this Islamic system, and with the long-term goal that the Islamic system will continue to increase in size until the conventional system withers away. I mean, I suppose that's in the minds of some of those people. And it's true that the Islamic sector of the financial services industry has continued to grow by leaps and bounds in Malaysia. Whether their products are really Islamic, I mean, this is a matter of debate, because the cornerstone of the products that were offered by Malaysian banks starting in the 80s was Bay al-Ina. And they said, well, Imam al-Shafi'i allowed it. They've become embarrassed about that to the extent that they're phasing that out. But they want to replace it with tawarruq, except they're not going to do it through the London Metal Exchange. They've set up their own exchange of palm oil, which is a fungible product that can be a medium for the kind of transactions that they want to do in tawarruq. And they said, well, we're also going to solve the problem that it's not allowed to take delivery. If anybody wants to take delivery of the palm oil that's sold in this platform, which is like a computerized system, they're free to do so. What happens in this trading system is that the palm oil that's sold in that tawarruq platform is 50% higher price than palm oil that's sold in an ordinary market. So you'd have to be crazy to demand delivery of that palm oil. So although technically delivery is possible, which solves one of the objections to the old system of tawarruq, in practice, delivery is never going to happen. So one other area that we have very little time, but just to talk about it briefly, where Islamic finance is penetrating is into non-Muslim countries. So England, they looked at the situation and said, hey, we can work with Islamic finance, and we're not going to give them preferential treatment, but we're going to remove any impediments to allowing it to function in England. So there are Islamic financial institutions in places like England and other Western countries now. We've run out of time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allahu a'lam.